quantum computers. This is Intelligent Performance.
Welcome to the Intelligent Performance Podcast. An absolute pleasure to have you with us. Today is our pleasure to have Daniel Lambert on the show. Daniel, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Michael. Great to be here.
Now, you're a bit of a celebrity, I'd say, in your niche, Dan, perhaps not on the main broader stream. You won't see you in the tabloids, but you certainly, if you're an expert in the water space, and my wife speaks incredibly highly of you in terms of your expertise back from the world of Arup, and you've got probably more expertise in the water space than many people who kind of walk the planet. So we're going to focus in on kind of the innovation you're bringing to this really interesting sector. It's one which we all rely on, of course, as we turn the tap on. A few of us think exactly where that water came from, but it's certainly we miss it when it doesn't work. And so, Dan, where I'd love to start this conversation is actually, what's your take on intelligent performance?
Great question, Michael. And we could probably talk on that for hours. Interestingly enough, I've just been reading a Patrick Lencioni book on working genius, and it's made me reflect on performance, but also the fact that each of us is unique. And I'm not sure if you've read the book or any of those of the listeners who haven't. It's he came up with an acronym called WIDGET, which is really around wonder, innovation, discernment, galvanizing, enabling, and tenacity. And each one of us has different strengths, and understanding what our strengths are and how they can bring value, what's our working genius, and how we can bring in value to performance is something that's really exciting. And so, for example, for me, my top two are innovation and discernment. So being intuitive, thinking outside the box, coming up with value, whereas some people are very strong in delivery and sort of following things through. And so for me, intelligent performance is really part of the question is understanding ourselves, understanding what makes us tick, what brings us life, how we add value to a team so that we can sort of bring that value. And that there's different types of intelligence for different types of roles and different types of thinking. So that's, without sort of going on about it, I thoroughly recommend you having a look at that working genius approach by Patrick Lencioni as one area to think about your performance and where you might fit in terms of that value cycle.
It's great. So I love that. There's a great book called The Big Leap. I'm not sure if you've come across that, but they kind of touch on the idea of a genius zone, excellence zone. And I remember the first time I read that, it was advised by a coach, and I was just like, whoa, that's such a powerful way to think about your skills, and certainly reframes how you approach things, right? So, and looking for those areas where you excel almost naturally, or kind of feel it becomes easy. So, very cool. I love the answer there. So, Dan, let's dive into the water space. So, you've spent years, like decades, in this domain, and specifically water infrastructure is what we're talking about, right? So, can you give us the the headlines or the kind of the brief intro to where you've kind of got to and why you think you've been able to rise to the top in this space, where I would not necessarily say it's a space of innovation, but perhaps I'm wrong, Dan. Maybe I kind of think about this whole sector incorrectly. It wouldn't strike me as particularly creative in that domain.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And I think one of the things for me about water is that when we work in this space, it's not just about solving technical problems. It's about how do we help people, how do we help the environment, how do we help shape the future. And so I went on a bit of a journey around doing engineering and understanding it from a head level and the problem-solving side, but probably not being enjoying that, but not being inspired by it. And it wasn't until I spent time working in Ecuador when I finished university that I really understood the impact. Like when we go into developing communities and we build water and sanitation systems, and we build relationship, that you can see how much it makes a difference in a person's heart and mind. And so water for me is something that I probably went on a bit of a journey from the head to the heart of understanding my why. And so that's probably early on in my career, and that's followed all the way through and had the opportunity to work in over 25 countries, a lot of them international development sort of contexts where you can see firsthand little ideas and innovations and the difference they make for people. And I think that piece you mentioned around innovation in the water sector, it's an interesting dynamic, because I think when we talk about water supply, for example, it needs to be well planned, and we need to make sure we have all the right processes in place to protect people, because it can be the difference between life and death if we don't get water quality right. So there is a risk management underlay for a lot of what we do in water, but at the same time, there's been huge innovations over the years, and we've seen incredible shifts in how do we recycle water and use it for drinking purposes? How do we use digital to do predictive analytics around failure of assets, etc.? How do we look at climate change and plan for that? How do we become net zero carbon, net zero nutrient? So there's a whole range of exciting innovations. And I think for me, if we get back and use that working genius as a reference, probably early on in my career, I felt like at times I felt like a bit of a round peg in a square hole, in that I think engineers can classically be thought of as, or traditionally thought of as, individuals who like to sit behind a computer or like to sit with drawings in front of them and just solve problems. Whereas the thing that brings me alive is having conversations, talking to people, understanding their drivers, and trying to make a positive difference through solving those problems in collaboration. And so that for me is my sort of thing that brings me life, and working then with amazing engineers that are brilliant in their fields, and trying to that whole better together approach of the engineers that are really good at the enablement, the tenacity, the actually taking ideas and bringing them to life is really enjoyable.
It's such it struck me early on, like I became very fascinated with climate change post uni. And I remember, you listen to a lot of the debate, especially the debate's still very classic here in Australia in terms of climate change, and a lot of the denial space in particular. And it always kind of struck me, because engineers arguably are the ones who figure out the technical side of the solution, right? And it's, you hear a lot. I think it was our friend from the Nationals, Barnaby Joyce, for an Australian audience, who's banging on about how solar doesn't produce electricity at night. And of course, the technical solution to that is battery or some sort of storage. And it's no different to, saying that, if it hasn't rained last night, then you can't use your tap. Like many years ago, engineers figured out how to do some sort of storage such that you can turn your tap on day and night, regardless of the rain conditions. It's the same concept. And I feel like engineers, as you say, if you get that beautiful pairing of creativity with that kind of ingenuity and kind of like love for the engineering principles, you can do incredible things, right? And that kind of speaks to this legacy company project that you're now working on. So tell us a little bit about what was what's the intent behind this new effort for you, which is really, it's an industry first, right, in terms of what you're trying to achieve in the water space.
Yes, very exciting space, and probably legacy is for everyone's benefit. Legacy is a water infrastructure developer, but really targeted towards the industrial water space. And one of the things we recognise is there's a lot of investment going into cities and solving problems with supply, water security with desalination, recycled water, etc. But in the industrial space, we have a rapidly growing demand for water, and we often have very sensitive environments in which projects operate. And we were looking at the Pilbara region, so northern part of Western Australia, and identified the fact that there's a lot of traditionally there's been a lot of damage to groundwater in that part of Australia, because mining companies have extracted water from the ground and in many instances over abstracted that water. So we identified a location with environmental damage. Also, in that same location, there's been a real focus on hydrogen, green steel manufacturing, lithium mines, a whole lot of projects that will unlock decarbonisation for the region and for Australia that need huge volumes of water. So we've got an already stressed water table, we've got additional demand. And then probably the other thing that, as I touched on before, that the impact of people is a huge part of my passion. The First Nations communities in many of these industrial areas have traditionally had challenging relationships with mining companies and other parties that have been using their land. And so we looked at how do we solve multiple problems at once. Mining companies don't usually build common infrastructure because they don't work with each other. First Nations, the engagement model wasn't working very well. And so we developed a scheme where we secured land tenure for seawater desalination. So that helped with the groundwater challenge. Developed a model for common user infrastructure, so the mines wouldn't have to build their own water supply schemes. They wouldn't need to engage and develop the models with the First Nations communities. They wouldn't have to maintain and operate the scheme. We would build it, and they would become an off-taker where they paid for water to be provided.
Yep.
Green energy powered. And then the most exciting part from my perspective is having the First Nations community, so Nalama Aboriginal Corporation, as equity partners in the project with free carry, which is the first. We think it's the first of its kind in the world for a water project.
Right.
Indigenous land use agreement royalties, and then a seat on the board, or a seat on the steerco all the way through the planning, and then a seat on the board where they have a genuine voice. So, for the first time in their life, in a water project, we've developed a model where they're on the board, where they have equity, where they feel genuinely valued. And the whole principle is we're building a project on their land. Why shouldn't they share in the benefits? Why shouldn't they have a voice? Why shouldn't they be a genuine partner? And why can't? And through common user infrastructure, we can develop something that makes it affordable for many and will create intergenerational wealth for the Nalama people.
And it's just because it's the type of market where there's no alternative. So like they need access to water, and you can only pillage the groundwater for so long until it becomes untenable. Is that right, or is that a false assumption?
It's partly that. I think some of the projects will genuinely need seawater desalination due to their sheer volume of water. Some of them could potentially continue to use groundwater, but as you say, over time it will continue to have deeper and deeper impacts. We're hoping the government will continue to strengthen legislation around groundwater abstraction. But I think it is it's a challenge that needed a new solution, because it's solving conflict between parties, it's making it more economically viable, it's accelerating decarbonisation, and it's doing it in a way where we think we can deliver win-win outcomes for all parties. And at the end of the day, when that happens, things should be easier to deliver, because there's not a winner and a loser. And I love those models where we can look at how do we deliver mutual benefits for everyone.
Yeah, really cool. So talk to us a little bit about the actual water requirements for lithium, because that's where we're seeing an explosion at the moment, right? And especially green hydrogen in terms of the requirements. Yep. How much water do you need for these types of things, Dan? Just to give us kind of a flavour of the scale.
Lithium mine. So the water requirements will be for the lithium mining operations. So they're significant, not at the scale of hydrogen or green steel manufacturing, but across. To give you an idea, we think that for this project, there's up to 150 gigalitres per annum of water demand, which for a non-water person just sounds like a number. But if we compare that to, it's the same size as the Victorian desalination plant in Melbourne, which is the biggest
Right.
in the Southern Hemisphere. So
Oh, yeah.
we are talking
Massive.
about a huge demand. A lot of it's from hydrogen. Hydrogen requires a huge amount of water because you're basically taking water and converting it into energy. Green steel manufacturing uses a reasonably significant amount. But then there's uses for communities in the region, potential use for agriculture, potential use for existing iron ore operations, and the the demand is huge, and therefore you can develop economies of scale around the partnership as well.
Is it a model that, like, I'm just thinking about the solar requirement or the kind of power requirement you're going to need to produce the desal plant, which is not exactly power light. Then you've got the mines. I'm guessing there's also this model could lead into shared ownership within a renewable energy plant, wind, whatever it might look like. Is that kind of what you're thinking in terms of that domain?
In terms of, yes, potentially. So we've got tenure for a huge parcel of land, and that could be used for renewable energy, or we may look to purchase it from another party. There's a number of renewable energy projects up in the Pilbara. Most of them, obviously, apart from hydrogen, a lot of them are solar and wind type projects that are being developed. But we're looking at, do we purchase renewable energy from a party, or do we develop a partnership with a renewable energy provider? And that model will enable us to, probably what I should say as well is, whilst our project will be energy intensive, it will be green energy powered, but the groundwater sources that have been tapped into by the resources sector, because it's brackish groundwater, so salty groundwater, they still need to do desalination. So the fact that we're taking that away and using green energy will have positive benefits as well.
Yeah, cool. Amazing. In terms of the water space more broadly, so you've obviously got this model. Have you taken this model from somewhere else, or are you just largely seeing across the board? I'm curious from a broader global lens, and especially given your backgrounds, what's the predominant model? It sounds like, maybe this is again an assumption, that there isn't a huge amount of innovation in this sector. It's just kind of like, the public, the private sector funded, or the public sector perhaps, and then it's just kind of like same old. Is that what you're finding largely?
I think in the industrial space, it's often less regulated. So you can create. So we've developed a whole new delivery model from scratch, because we've had a blank canvas to work with, but the model can then be potentially applied in the municipal space or into other states. But in terms of how we developed it, we looked long and hard at the challenges in the Pilbara, and we developed some thinking around it. But it wasn't us. One of the things that's really important when we go and work in First Nations communities is it's not about us coming and imposing a solution on a community. It's about engaging and listening and learning. And so one of the things I've loved is, from day one, we saw that there was a huge demand for water in the Pilbara, but we didn't, and we had some ideas, but we sat down with Nala and said, what's worked well and what hasn't worked well in terms of your partnerships in the past? What looks like, how does good look for you as a community in terms of outcomes? And
interesting.
Listening and learning and understanding their culture, understanding how they value water, understanding how they value engagement processes was really key. And then also, as you say, looking around the world. So probably two standout examples around First Nations partnerships are Canada and New Zealand. And there's some really interesting models with First Nations in Canada. What we discovered as we dug deeper is the government gets quite involved and provides loans to First Nations communities to help them take equity. So different to what we've done. We're providing free carry equity without the government sort of providing that loan at this stage. New Zealand's got some good models, but so we can always, as you know, we can always learn from different environments around the world and in our own nation, but then understanding the context and building the partnership and the relationship and trust is absolutely key. So the Nalama community has been fantastic in terms of giving us their time and giving us that opportunity to explore. And we, off the back of that, we developed a few different models and ideas that we've been socializing with them so they can then work through what's the best approach for them as a community.
I'm curious on the free carry piece, and just maybe translate that to make sure I understand. Basically, you're saying free equity. Is that correct? Is that what you mean by free carry?
Yes, but the free carry part of, so they're being given free equity during the development of the project. But what can happen is sometimes First Nations communities are given equity, but then as you develop the project, investments are required, and they don't have the capacity to invest. And so their equity share gets diluted to the point where it's worth very little. So free carry equity means that the equity that they get at the start, they don't have to invest at all along the way to maintain that equity for the life of the project. So it's protecting their position. And I don't think at times First Nations communities haven't been aware of, they've been told they have equity, but they haven't been aware of how a development and investment process works. So we're genuinely trying to protect their interests.
Many startup founders have come undone in similar ways.
That's right. A big number of equity at the start doesn't always mean much depending on the process you're going through.
Correct. Or who you partnered with.
Journey.
Sure.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Fascinating. So in terms of what you've seen globally, and if we just kind of broaden it out, sustainability, innovation, social outcomes is where you're that's your wheelhouse. In terms of if you look more broadly in terms of water, obviously climate change is playing out in a really weird and wonderful way. In some models, it seems to be far worse than we ever thought in terms of the heating. It's happening far quicker, and but often the kind of the tail, the predictions haven't sometimes materialized. It takes a lot of time for the globe as a system to adjust, right? So it's that issue where a lot of scientists seem to quote unquote know what's going to happen, but the day-to-day reality hasn't shifted that much. So everyone's kind of like, well, what's the problem, right? So from your perspective, I'm curious, is the government, is the experts, is that keeping pace with actually what the predicted future is looking like? Or what's your kind of assessment on that, given you've been in this space for some time now, right?
Yeah, huge question. And I think the government, every government around the world's probably at a different sort of journey of maturity around their views on climate change. Every state government within Australia's got slightly different approaches and maturity. I think that we have seen a really positive step forward in Australia in terms of the focus on decarbonisation, on the investment that's happening at a federal level, and then the states that obviously in particular specific states that are investing huge amount of money in hydrogen, etc. And Western Australia is one of them. I think the question of, so I think the government's genuinely supportive. I think in certain instances, it's interesting to compare how the Australian government invests in supporting industry compared to the Middle East, compared to America. So sometimes we're finding industrial clients are finding it challenging because there are huge incentives in other markets for them to develop renewable energy projects, which aren't always as easy to navigate or unlock here. So
is that like the Middle East app?
Is it? Yes, yeah. So Middle East is one of those where, getting access to land, approvals, funding in the Middle East can be extremely streamlined because they're trying to attract parties, and it can be quite complex in Australia. And part of that is Western Australia, for example, huge amount of it's native title. So how do we engage effectively with First Nations communities? How do we streamline our government approval processes and while still being prudent in the outcomes we achieve? What sort of investments are required at the front end to incentivize them to invest here? So
Yeah.
Many of the parties around hydrogen or green steel manufacturing are international players. So I think there's a role we need to continue to look at the role government plays in supporting that. I mean, it's also interesting, obviously, at a federal level, we find we've got two parties which often have very different views on how they look at climate change and government policy around investment, etc. And so there's often a question of which party's in power, and we're about to go into another election. And so when you ask me that question today, my answer might be slightly different to what it might be in 6 months' time, depending on how things play out.
Sure.
But what I would say is the government can't solve all the problems by themselves. So how do they, in my view, what are the ways that we can effectively incentivize and support and enable the private sector to help? And the Nalama Water Project, which we've been talking about, one of the reasons I'm really excited about it is the government is working is working very well with Legacy to help unlock that model. And it's a model that unlocks decarbonisation, but also hopefully we think sets a precedent for First Nations partnerships. And that's been a credit to the government, the federal government. That's been a huge focus of economic empowerment. And we're seeing that in the renewable energy sector. But in the water sector as well, there's opportunities for us to unlock models with equity, with genuine partnerships that provide huge benefits to our First Nations partners.
Just taking a look at Middle East, and you mentioned the US too. How are they approaching this? Because I feel like the US again is a bit of a watershed moment, right? In terms of their elections even closer than our own. In terms of like, if it feels like it's the Biden, the renewable energy effort, they've really dived down there. With the Middle East is interesting because they're in a water stressed environment already, right? They're like probably where many countries will probably end up in a global heating capacity. So they're kind of like already dealing with it. Their reality is like no water already, and they're still managing sustainably, unsustainably, however you might think about it, to quote unquote thrive. Actually, you can't look at Dubai and not say they're thriving. So I'm curious, what are you seeing from that space in terms of how they've approached water infrastructure? I'm aware desal, I think it plays a huge part down there, right, in terms of how they're doing things.
Yes, desal in the Middle East has been huge, and I suppose where I'm heading with the Middle East, and we'll talk about America in a second, but the Middle East has been, in addition to continuing to support desalination, they're actively trying to attract the hydrogen projects, the green steel manufacturing projects.
Interesting.
Where they can create renewable energy industry. And often, how do they make that energy transition over time from oil and gas in some of these regions into other areas? And to a certain degree, Dubai was a city that was created to help take the wealth that was generated from those areas and turn it into a city which had particularly retail industries and other things that made it a sustainable future. And I think they'll be looking at how do they, a bit like we've got Queensland at the moment, trying to pivot from coal into renewables. How does the Middle East pivot from oil into other renewables? And in America, I mean, America's always a complex conversation because every state's so different. And yes, I think under Biden there's been a huge focus on renewables. What will happen post-election depends on how that plays out. But they've invested a huge amount supporting industry developing, and they've also had different types of incentivization models, which I think have helped as well around tariffs, etc. So there's lessons we can learn from both of them. Obviously, our context is slightly different, but I often think there's more. I think I look at Australia and think we've been blessed with huge volumes of natural resources, which have played a critical role in our economy for years. And often we've dug them out and made a lot of money just selling them, and then the value add of processing and manufacturing, etc. Iron ore to steel, for example, has been done overseas. And imagine we can unlock green steel manufacturing in Australia. So bring back to life some of the manufacturing, but also do it in a way that's genuinely delivering positive outcomes to the environment. A lot of people don't realize, but about 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from manufacturing steel. So just by looking at a new ways of manufacturing in that space is really exciting. And there's all sorts of other things that we need to look at, but we can, given our iron ore resources are so vast, and a lot of them are in the Pilbara, how do we turn them into something? How do we turn that into an opportunity that and maximise that opportunity? Is something that I'm really excited to see us as a country focusing on.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. We look at the Norwegian model, right, in terms of how they've utilised their extraction of resources and then turned it into a public good. I feel that's a really fascinating model compared to how we've run it down here, where it's mainly overseas interests, which they claim all the profits. Whereas the Queensland royalty, when we drive around, no doubt you would have seen it as you drive down to Brisbane. You know, like the coal royalty is getting, it's a very interesting thing, right? But it's novel that in terms of here, but actually more broadly, it's a very common thing that if you extract something from a country, then guess what? They also benefit rather than just your shareholders.
Yes.
It's kind of wild.
Exactly.
It's wild that that's so like, oh my God, like this is such a new thing. It's like, wow, really? Like, so, but is that more broadly, is that just the way it's been done, Dan? I'm curious about in developing nations now where they get to maybe the benefit of looking at Western countries, and now where they're planning their infrastructure, are they thinking about different models, or do they look at the West and go, crikey, that's not that great? Or what is that general perspective, perhaps?
I think we'd like to hope that they're learning and able to leapfrog some of the things that we've done. I love the Africa example, where we've had nations that have gone straight to mobile phone technology and sort of skipped the whole landline infrastructure. So what does the leapfrogging look like in the energy space is an interesting question. And part of it depends to a certain extent on where they are. So I think developing countries that are rich in coal resources, and need income and revenue, and there is a natural sort of it's hard to make decisions about that when you're in that context. And you don't have the wealth of a nation like Australia or the US, etc. So whereas countries that have huge potential for other renewables, that can be easier to accelerate that step change. So I think it varies. I think that they can definitely leapfrog us or leapfrog a generation in terms of use of technology and consideration of impacts. And so, how do we share those lessons learned, and how do we help develop renewable energy industries in these countries? I think something that is really interesting. The Australian government's I'm involved in the Australian Water Partnership, and they help leverage Australian expertise into unlocking industry overseas. So we've been doing a lot of work looking at how do we take pumped hydro expertise from Australia and then apply it in a Asian context, for example. And so you're not just building dams for water supply, you're building them to generate energy resources for communities and for nations. So sharing, one of the beautiful parts about us moving to a global economy and having I love to say seamless, but more seamless sort of engagement across nations and between industries means that knowledge sharing can be accelerated, and therefore sharing benefits can be accelerated.
Yeah, it's super cool to hear that, and I feel like, it sounds like the industrial space in particular because it's less regulated, because it's got less interference from you're not giving it to people. You've got a bit more leg room perhaps to get more creative. Is that how it plays out, Dan? And is that how you're able to do this kind of new model?
Yes, definitely. I think that because it's not as regulated, because we're dealing with a lot of private sector organizations, because we're coming to First Nations communities and saying, with a genuine, open approach, saying, how do we?
We'll work with you.
Something's broken. How do we work together to do it differently?
Yeah.
But yes, so I think it's almost a good sandpit for innovation. But I think there are lessons that we can then take to the municipal environment. We can take to developing countries and apply more effectively. But one of my big learnings in life is, which I continue to learn, but it's just going in and listening and learning and asking good questions, because we can learn so much from others if we approach things humbly and seek knowledge and work together to shape ideas. And so that collaboration piece is something that I think we can apply in all realms of life. Yeah,
100%. I feel like this podcast, in many ways, is exactly that. It's very mixed the types of people we pull in, but the ability to learn about different topics and bring in people, absolutely best in class types of people like yourself. It's you just shut up and let them talk, and you just learn heaps on the other side. So Dan, I think on that point, I would love to kind of draw this conversation to a close. I think it's been a fascinating insight to the world of water. Tell us, how can people reach you if they've got further questions around legacy or any of the other work that you're doing?
Yeah, always happy to connect and feel free to reach out to me by LinkedIn, or I'm sure Michael can pass on my contact details. Michael touched on it today, but obviously legacy is one of the areas I'm involved in, but there's a range of different not-for-profits and other organizations working in the humanitarian space that really help in that social, environmental area. So love to hear and learn from others who want to share and engage as well.
Super cool. Dan, we'll put a link to your LinkedIn on the show notes below. And for now, but massive thank you for taking the time out to chat to us. It's been eye-opening and amazing work. I'm really looking forward to seeing the progress on legacy and how that actually comes to fruition.
Thanks so much, Michael. Great to connect.